In the first week of September 1997, the entire world was watching the British royal family. And the British royal family was failing the test in real time. Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead at 36, killed in a Paris tunnel, and the public grief was a tidal wave no palace protocol had ever prepared for. The flag over Buckingham Palace wouldn't fly at half-mast. The Queen stayed silent in Scotland for days, and in the middle of it all, among the senior royals who finally returned to face the crowds, was a 97-year-old woman whom the nation adored without reservation, the Queen Mother. The cameras were on everyone that week, reading every face for the grief the public demanded, and viewers have spent years studying one face in particular, the great-grandmother of Diana's two boys, the matriarch of the family Diana had married into and been destroyed by, looking for the sorrow that, by many readings, simply wasn't there. Because the truth the public never knew was this: the most beloved grandmother in Britain had never had much warmth for the most beloved princess in the world, and the worst week in the monarchy's modern history put two of the nation's favorites in the same frame, with almost nothing between them but cold. That paradox is the starting point. Both women were genuinely adored, not in the polite, dutiful way that British people sometimes admire distant figures, but actively, personally, with real warmth. The Queen Mother's 90th birthday in 1990 and her 100th in 2000 attracted crowds of well-wishers who regarded her as something between a grandmother and a national monument. Diana generated a different kind of devotion entirely, something rawer and more urgent, but equally real. By 1997, polls consistently placed both women among the most respected members of the royal family. The monarchy ran on the popularity of both of them simultaneously. The public had no particular reason to suspect that Britain's two most cherished royal women had spent the better part of 2 decades regarding each other across a distance that never closed. To understand why that distance existed, you have to begin not with Diana at all, but with a crisis that happened 25 years before Diana Spencer was born. On 11 December 1936, Edward VIII signed the Instrument of Abdication. His brother, Prince Albert, Duke of York, a man who had not expected the throne, had not wanted it, and suffered from a debilitating stammer that made public speaking a torment, became King George VI. The woman beside him, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the first British-born queen consort since the Tudor era, became queen consort. She had not signed up for this. She had married the second son, expecting the quieter life of a duchess. What Edward's abdication cost her husband, and therefore her, is documented with particular clarity in William Shawcross's official biography, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which was authorized by Queen Elizabeth II in July 2003 and gave Shawcross unrestricted access to the royal archives. The burden of kingship. George VI had not sought, damaged his health progressively throughout the 15 years of his reign. He died in his sleep on 6 February 1952, aged 56. Shawcross's biography records her as believing, to the end of her life, that her husband's early death was the direct consequence of the weight his brother had placed on him. She referred to Edward with bitterness in later years, and her feeling about him and Wallis Simpson never softened. Commentary on Shawcross's biography is explicit on the connection. Her opposition to Prince Charles's second marriage decades later was deeply felt, rooted in her memories of the abdication crisis of 1936. To her, no single person's romantic happiness was worth what the crown had paid for Edward's. That conviction became the structural principle of her entire life. During the Blitz, when the cabinet advised her to evacuate her daughters to safety outside London, she refused. Her documented reply has been confirmed by the royal household's own official records. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." She wasn't performing courage for the cameras. She genuinely believed that the role was the role. that the crown made its demands and you met them, that the private person inside the public one wasn't available for negotiation. Shawcross describes her in terms that might have come from a Victorian sermon: a woman of consuming interest in other people, deep religious faith, and total commitment to Britain and the Commonwealth. A Guardian review of the biography in 2009 noted that Shawcross characterizes her as nothing less than a latter-day Esther, a woman of faith and patriotism, whose courage enabled her to serve. This is the authorized account, and it's therefore sympathetic to its subject. But even allowing for that, the portrait that emerges is unmistakably consistent. A woman who believed, at the cellular level, that the monarchy's survival depended on restraint, on silence about private suffering, on the absolute subordination of personal unhappiness to institutional duty. The old royal maxim, "Never complain, never explain," predates her by decades. Most historians trace it back to Victorian political culture, but she was its most thoroughgoing embodiment in the 20th century. She didn't coin it, she lived it. The distinction matters because it tells you that her creed wasn't a performance or a pose. It was the sincere expression of everything she had watched happen to her family and to the institution she had devoted her widowhood to protecting. Now bring Diana Spencer into this frame. Diana Frances Spencer was born on 1 July 1961 at Park House on the Sandringham estate, and her family connections to the Queen Mother's world were intimate before she ever met Charles. Both of Diana's grandmothers had served as ladies-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. Her maternal grandmother, Ruth Roche, Lady Fermoy, is described in multiple biographies as one of the Queen Mother's close personal friends. Diana grew up calling the Queen herself Aunt Lilibet and played with Princes Andrew and Edward as a child. When she arrived at Balmoral in the summer of 1980 to be observed as a potential bride for the Prince of Wales, she wasn't a stranger entering a foreign environment. She was the granddaughter of a woman the Queen Mother counted as a companion. This matters for what came later, because it makes the subsequent distance more structurally notable rather than less. The Queen Mother wasn't dealing with an unknown outsider. She knew exactly what family Diana came from, and Tina Brown, in the Diana Chronicles published in 2007, reports that the Queen Mother was initially pleased by Charles's selection. Diana ticked every box the old guard required: aristocratic lineage, Church of England, the right schools, young enough to be shaped, from a family with deep Windsor connections. Brown notes that the Queen Mother considered how perfectly Diana fit the profile of a suitable royal bride. She moved into Clarence House, the Queen Mother's official residence, the night before the wedding on 28 July 1981, a detail that carries its own significance. The family was closing ranks around her, welcoming her into the fold. The unraveling was gradual, then total. By the mid-1980s, Diana's emotional distress was becoming difficult to contain within the family's preferred framework of dignified silence. Her bulimia was a physical expression of internal anguish. Her marriage to Charles was deteriorating under the weight of incompatibility and his ongoing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. And crucially, Diana was beginning to develop a relationship with the public, and with the media, that operated entirely outside the institutional protocols she had been expected to absorb. The AIDS ward was the clearest early signal. In April 1987, Diana opened the UK's first dedicated HIV/AIDS ward at the Middlesex Hospital. She shook hands with the patients without gloves, at a moment when public fear of AIDS transmission was still acute and the stigma was catastrophic. Bill Clinton would later say that the act had significant impact in changing the world's opinion and gave hope to people with the disease. That is partly the hagiographic retrospect of grief, but the immediate effect was also undeniable. Diana had stepped around the institutional management of royal image and done something personal, emotionally transparent, and photogenic in exactly the way the old guard regarded with deep suspicion. She cried in public. She hugged strangers. She spoke candidly about her own unhappiness, not in controlled, authorized formats, but in ways the palace couldn't predict or manage. Sally Bedell Smith, in Elizabeth the Queen, portrays the Queen Mother as set in pre-war royal norms and deeply uneasy with the turmoil of the Wales marriage as it became public. Her sympathies, Bedell Smith reports, lay with Charles. Bedell Smith drew on interviews with Lady Elizabeth Anson, the Queen's cousin and confidant, who recounted the anguish of the period, and her account is consistent with what Patrick Jephson, Diana's own private secretary from 1988 to 1996, describes from the inside. Jephson's memoir, Shadows of a Princess, notes that staff understood Clarence House, the Queen Mother's household, to be firmly on Charles's side in the marital conflict. Diana herself came to believe, as Andrew Morton records from her own taped testimony, that the older generation regarded her as a problem to be managed rather than a family member to be supported. In those tapes, she describes feeling isolated on family holidays, everyone else gravitating toward the Queen Mother or the Queen, while she sat apart. No letter from the Queen Mother to Diana exists in the public record that contradicts this. No documented warm exchange, no evidence of sustained mentoring, or of any serious attempt to guide Diana through the institutional demands of her role. The relationship appears to have developed, or rather not developed, through non-engagement. As Diana's distress became more visible, the Queen Mother's response was to remain loyal to Charles and to the institution, and Diana experienced that as indifference, or as something harder. Tina Brown, drawing on accounts from people close to the Queen Mother, reports that she came to regard Diana as self-dramatizing, indiscreet, and damaging to Charles's prospects as future king. Brown attributes phrases along these lines to the Queen Mother's circle rather than to the Queen Mother directly, and this attribution matters. There is no verified, primary source written record of the Queen Mother using dismissive language about Diana in her own voice. What the biographers document is a consistent pattern of attitude reported through intermediaries. That pattern is credible. It isn't the same as a verbatim confession. What is documented directly is her reaction to the Morton book. On 16 June 1992, Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story, was published by Michael O'Mara Books. It exposed Diana's bulimia, her suicide attempts, her loneliness, and Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. At the time of publication, Buckingham Palace denied Diana had cooperated. She had, extensively. Secret tape-recorded interviews conducted through an intermediary, her friend James Colthurst, who cycled the questions and cassettes between Diana and Morton throughout 1991. The book would eventually be described as having forever changed the way the public viewed the British monarchy. Both Tina Brown and Sally Bedell Smith report the Queen Mother's response. She was appalled. Not at Charles, not at the marriage, not at the institution's failure to protect Diana from such desperate isolation that she collaborated on her own tell-all. She was appalled at the breach of royal discretion. She saw the public airing of grievances as a violation of the foundational principle that it held the monarchy together through wars and crises and abdication. You didn't do this. You endured privately, and you presented the institution intact. Diana had done the opposite, and done it with devastating public effect. Prime Minister John Major announced the legal separation of Charles and Diana in the House of Commons on 9 December 1992. Multiple biographies record the Queen Mother's sympathies lying with Charles rather than Diana through this period. The divorce was finalized in 1996, and Diana lost the title Her Royal Highness. Then came November 1995. On 20th of November 1995, Diana sat across from Martin Bashir on the BBC's Panorama program and said, among other things, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." She questioned whether Charles was suited to be king. She admitted her own adultery. She described her suffering with a directness and emotional fluency that 19 million British viewers watched in stunned attention. The Queen Mother, according to a royal historian whose account is consistent with the broader record of her circle's reaction, was completely and utterly horrified. The specific offense, this historian reports, was the way Diana criticized her grandson. The Queen Mother's world, as Shawcross documents it, had no framework for this. She couldn't understand anyone who would wash their dirty linen in public. Tina Brown, in her later book The Palace Papers, describes the panorama quote about 3 people in the marriage as the one that will live forever. And she sets it in the context of the older generation's horror at Diana's willingness to weaponize her own vulnerability on national television. From the Queen Mother's perspective, constructed from a lifetime of institutional loyalty and reinforced by everything the abdication had cost her family, what Diana did in November 1995 wasn't brave or emotionally honest. It was the same error Edward VIII had made, only more systematic and more damaging. Subordinating the institution to the individual, choosing personal expression over the collective that depended on dignity and silence. Diana knew by this point exactly whose side the matriarch was on. There is an important complication to the story of the Queen Mother's position during the marital crisis, and it involves Camilla Parker Bowles. The Queen Mother knew the Parker Bowles family socially through long-standing connections. Camilla and her family stayed at Burke Hall, the Queen Mother's house near Balmoral, on social visits. This wasn't a hostile relationship, but when Charles and Camilla's relationship became a formalized public matter, she was, according to royal historian accounts, not pleased at all. Her opposition to Charles marrying Camilla was rooted in exactly the same logic as her horror at Diana's Panorama interview, the 1936 abdication. Edward had abdicated for a divorced woman and broken the institution. She wasn't willing to endorse Charles doing a version of the same thing. Informed royal commentators have consistently said that Charles wouldn't have married Camilla while his grandmother was alive. When he did, in 2005, 3 years after her death, Camilla wore a ring from the Queen Mother's collection, described as giving the relationship an apparent seal of approval it had not received during her lifetime. This isn't a detail that exonerates the Queen Mother on the subject of Diana. If anything, it clarifies the geometry. She didn't dislike Diana because she loved Camilla. She was profoundly uncomfortable with the entire disaster of the Wales marriage because it threatened, from multiple directions, the institution she had given her life to protecting. Diana was the visible wound. She was the one going public, and the Queen Mother's response to visible wounds was always the same: close them. The bond between the Queen Mother and Charles was genuinely close, documented across biographers. Shawcross records her as having seen herself as an emotional substitute for his absent or busy parents when he was a child, and this bond persisted through his unhappy marriage. He dined with her regularly at Clarence House. He confided in her. Bedell Smith's biography of Charles includes a fragment of correspondence from the Queen Mother, supportive, written in terms of personal encouragement, that indicates she never hesitated to back him. When the marriage disintegrated and the competing narratives went public, Charles had his grandmother's sympathy, and Diana knew it. Patrick Jeffson describes Diana's awareness of this with the specific knowledge of a staff member who watched the institutional atmosphere from the inside. Diana believed the older courtiers and senior royals regarded her as a problem to be managed, not a family member to be supported. The court's sympathies, as Jeffson documents them, weren't neutral. Clarence House was on one side of the line, Diana was on the other. The 4th of August, 1997. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother, turns 97. She is, by any measure, in extraordinary condition for her age, still attending horse racing at Sandringham, still hosting gatherings at Royal Lodge. She will attend the Queen's annual summer gathering at Balmoral later that month, staying at Burke Hall as she always did, her own house close to the main castle. At 4 a.m. Paris time on 31st August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, dies at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital from injuries sustained in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The 2008 British inquest, Operation Paget, returned a verdict of unlawful killing by grossly negligent driving. The cause of death is settled. The Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, Princes William and Harry, the Queen Mother, the entire senior royal family is at Balmoral. What followed was the worst public relations catastrophe the House of Windsor had faced since the abdication. The royal standard does not fly over Buckingham Palace when the monarch isn't in residence, and it's constitutionally never flown at half-mast. The flag represents the continuity of the crown, and the crown has no interregnum. These are facts of constitutional protocol, not decisions made by individuals in grief. But the public didn't know this, and the media didn't explain it. The absence of a flag over the palace was read as cold indifference. The family in Scotland was read as hiding. The silence from the Queen, 4 days of it, was read as contempt for the woman the country was covering in flowers. More than 1 million bouquets were left at Kensington Palace. By 10 September, the pile outside Kensington Gardens was 5 feet deep in places. Alistair Campbell's diaries document the Blair government working the phones to the palace, urging a response. The Washington Post ran a front page on 5 September with the headline, "Queen orders flag at half-staff at palace. British royal family responds to criticism." That headline is itself a piece of evidence. The public concession required public pressure on a scale the palace had never previously faced. The Queen Mother was at Birkhall during all of this. The decisions about protocol, the flag, the broadcast, the return to London, were the Queen's and her advisors. The Queen Mother, 97 years old, exercised no day-to-day strategic role in these decisions. As Bedell Smith's research and the broader biographical record make clear, her influence by this point was exercised through presence, through private counsel, through the weight of her existence as the institution's matriarch, not through operational management. But she was there. She was in Scotland with the family. Sir Michael Oswald, the Queen Mother's trusted racing advisor, and his wife Angela are on record as saying that she was hugely upset during this period. Upset specifically by the attacks on the Queen in response to the family's silence. Her distress, by this account, was directed at the criticism being leveled at the institution, at the daughter who had inherited her throne. The monarchy being attacked by its own subjects for failing to mourn correctly. This was the horror. Not Diana's death itself, the institution being held hostage to public grief. Her lifelong creed made that the more unbearable loss. On the 5th of September 1997, the royal family returned to London. Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret came south together. That evening, the Queen delivered a live, televised address from Buckingham Palace. Her official text included, "This week at Balmoral, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and all of us have suffered." The next day, 6th of September, a Union flag, not the royal standard, was flown at half-mast over Buckingham Palace for the first time in history, a permanent change to the protocol that has held ever since. That flag flew as the Queen Mother, at 97, took her place in the public frame and walked out to greet the mourners. And here is where the story becomes, for viewers who have watched the footage, the hardest part to navigate honestly. What the cameras show from the funeral week is footage. What the footage means is interpretation. These aren't the same thing, and collapsing them has been the error of lesser coverage of this subject. The footage is real. The interpretation requires care. On the 5th of September, television cameras captured the Queen Mother standing outside Buckingham Palace with the Queen and other members of the family, observing the sea of flowers, greeting mourners. She appears frail, heavily reliant on a stick, walking slowly. Her expression, as she stands in frame, is composed and unsmiling, neutral, or, by certain readings, bleak. These are physical descriptions of what footage shows. At the funeral on 6th of September, the cameras catch her walking behind Diana's coffin with the Queen. She looks grave, pale, composed rather than overtly distressed. A face performing no particular emotion for the cameras. Viewers and commentators have spent years reading that composure, and the readings vary depending on what they already know or believe about the relationship. Some see grief controlled by a woman of 97 who has learned over decades not to perform for cameras. Some see a woman whose face, in the hardest possible week for the institution she loved, simply doesn't register the loss the same way the crowd outside does. Both readings are possible. Neither is provable from footage alone. What can be said is this: the Queen Mother, by the time of that funeral, had 97 years of practice at presenting a composed public face under pressure. She had stood beside bombed buildings during the Blitz with a composed public face. She had buried a husband and a daughter and survived a century with a composed public face. The suggestion that a composed public face in September 1997 constitutes a unique evidence of coldness toward Diana specifically requires more than footage to sustain. The footage shows restraint. It doesn't show its cause. What the relationship history shows, and this is the documented record, not the footage, is that the cause was almost certainly there. According to Tina Brown's account in the Diana Chronicles, and consistent with Bedell Smith's reporting in Elizabeth the Queen Mother had spent the better part of 2 decades regarding Diana as temperamental, indiscreet, and dangerous to the institution. Jeffson's inside account places Clarence House on Charles's side of the conflict explicitly. Diana's own taped testimony to Andrew Morton describes her isolation from the senior generation of the family. The pattern across 4 independent accounts, biographer, staff memoir, official biography, and Diana's own voice, is consistent. The Queen Mother never warmed to her grandson's wife. By the 1990s, she actively disapproved of the way Diana had chosen to fight. The footage from September 1997 lands on top of that record. A face can't be a confession, and footage isn't a diary. But the relationship history before that week is real, documented, and carries its own weight. The paradox at the heart of this story is worth sitting with for a moment, not in the sentimental sense, but in the structural one. 2 women, both genuinely beloved by the British public, occupying the same family, the same public life, the same national imagination, with almost no warmth between them. The public never knew, because neither woman ever told them. The Queen Mother's creed required silence. You didn't complain. You didn't explain. You didn't tell anyone that your grandson's wife was dismantling the institution from the inside. You simply maintained your composure and your loyalty and hoped the damage could be contained. Diana's creed, which was less a creed than an instinct, required the opposite: visibility, emotional candor, the use of public connection as both a survival mechanism and a source of genuine power. She told Morton's tape recorder things that no member of the royal family had ever told anyone on record. She sat across from Martin Bashir and described the inside of her marriage in terms that made 19 million people feel they knew her personally. Both women were extraordinarily good at what they did. That's the cruelty of it. Diana's popularity wasn't incidental to the institutional threat she represented. It was the mechanism of that threat. The more the public loved her, the more difficult it became for the palace to manage her. Tina Brown makes this connection explicitly in her writing. As Diana's popularity grew, her power relative to the institution grew with it. She had an independent public base that no palace decision could extinguish, and the Panorama interview made clear she was willing to use it. The Queen Mother, who had watched Edward VIII subordinate the institution to personal happiness and watched her husband pay for it with his health and his life, was watching a version of the same dynamic play out again, with different mechanics but identical stakes. She wasn't a cartoon villain in this story. She was a 90-something woman whose entire life had been structured around the conviction that the institution came first, that personal feeling was private, and that the crown's survival required exactly the kind of self-suppression Diana was incapable of. She wasn't wrong that Diana was destabilizing the monarchy. She was wrong Or rather, she was a product of a world that was becoming wrong in real time, in believing that the solution was silence and institutional loyalty. The public in 1997 didn't want the institution's survival. They wanted grief. The nation buried Diana on 6 September 1997, and it watched the royal family the entire time, hunting every face for the grief it was owed. Most of those faces gave it. One, by many readings, didn't. The 97-year-old matriarch who had spent her whole life believing the institution mattered more than any single person inside it, and who had never quite forgiven Diana for proving how wrong that could feel. We will never know exactly what the Queen Mother thought as she stood in that frame, because a face isn't a confession, and footage isn't a diary. But we know what came before it. Years of cold distance between Britain's two most beloved women, hidden in plain sight, until the worst week in the monarchy's history put them in the same shot, with the whole world watching, and almost nothing warm between them. The Queen Mother died on 30 March 2002 at Royal Lodge, Windsor, aged 101. Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005. Camilla wore a ring from the Queen Mother's collection on that day, described by those who knew the history as giving the relationship an apparent seal of approval it had never received while she was alive. A small irony at the end of a large story. If you want more stories like this one, history told without the shortcuts, with the evidence handled carefully and the complexity left intact, subscribe. There are more of them coming.